January 17, 1945. Hürtgen Forest, Germany. The frozen earth cracked beneath their boots. Snow fell in silent sheets through the skeletal remains of fir trees, each trunk splintered by artillery into jagged teeth pointing toward a colorless sky. The air tasted of cordite, and pine sap frozen mid-bleed. In a makeshift command bunker dug into the hillside, Oberst Friedrich Muller of the 272nd Volksgrenadier Division pressed his binoculars against tired eyes and watched the American positions across the ravine. His breath formed clouds in the subterranean cold. Behind him, a junior officer marked casualty reports on a map already crowded with red pencil slashes. The numbers told a story Muller had seen repeated across 3 winters of retreat. Ammunition low, rations scarce, morale collapsing like wet paper. Yet the Americans, those Americans across the valley, they kept coming. Muller had fought at Stalingrad. He had witnessed the slow starvation of the Sixth Army, watched proud Panzer commanders burn their last code books and eat horses that had already been stripped to bone by desperate infantrymen. He understood defeat. He had calculated its mathematics in frozen corpses and empty supply depots. When he looked through those binoculars at the American lines on that gray January morning, he expected to see the mirror image of his own deterioration. Exhausted men conserving their strength, waiting for the logic of attrition to make surrender inevitable. The Wehrmacht doctrine had always maintained that any rational commander, when faced with overwhelming casualties and diminishing resources, would recognize the calculus of survival. Muller had written the recommendation himself 3 days prior. Proposed ceasefire terms, negotiate an orderly withdrawal. He expected the Americans to do the same. They were pragmatists, weren't they? Businessmen in uniform. Surely they understood that throwing more lives into the Hürtgen meat grinder served no purpose, when both sides could barely move through the frozen mud and shattered forests. Then the artillery began. Not the scattered harassment fire that had punctuated the previous week, but a rolling thunder that seemed to tear the sky apart at its seams. Muller dropped into the bunker as the first salvos walked across the German positions, each explosion sending frozen dirt and tree fragments spinning through the air like shrapnel. The barrage lasted 40 minutes. When it lifted, Muller crawled back to his observation post, certain that this was merely preparatory fire before defensive repositioning. Through the smoke and swirling snow, he saw movement, not retreat, advance. Long lines of American infantry emerging from their positions, moving forward to their own artillery's lingering haze, rifles at the ready, pushing directly into the teeth of German defensive positions that had been considered impregnable just hours before. "Sie sind verrückt," whispered the junior officer beside him. "They are insane." But they were not insane. They were American. And on that frozen morning in the Hürtgen forest, Oberst Muller began to understand that he had fundamentally miscalculated what kind of enemy he faced. The battle for the Hürtgen forest had already consumed 5 months by the time Muller watched those soldiers advance through the snow. American commanders had poured division after division into those 50 square miles of German borderland. The 1st Infantry, the 4th Infantry, the 28th Infantry, the 8th Infantry, each formation ground down to a fraction of its strength in some of the most savage close-quarters combat the Western Front had witnessed. The forest itself became an adversary. Dense fir plantations that reduced visibility to mere yards, trails that turned to sucking mud under autumn rains and then froze into rutted concrete by winter. Artillery shells detonated in the tree canopy, sending wooden shrapnel down on soldiers who had no protection against shards of pine traveling at rifle bullet velocity. Casualties mounted with mathematical horror. Some companies lost 70% of their strength. Trench foot disabled thousands more. The 28th Infantry Division entered the forest with 14,000 men and emerged with barely 4,000 combat-effective soldiers. German commanders watched this carnage and drew what seemed like rational conclusions. The Americans were learning the same lessons the Wehrmacht had learned at Stalingrad and Kursk, that modern warfare had evolved into a form of industrial attrition where attacking was simply too costly to sustain. They were wrong. What Muller and his fellow officers failed to comprehend was not a matter of tactics or terrain, but fundamental philosophy. The German military tradition, stretching back through Clausewitz and Frederick the Great, viewed warfare as a chess match played by professionals, a contest where positions were evaluated and losses calculated with dispassionate precision. When a position became untenable, When the correlation of forces shifted beyond a critical threshold, the rational commander preserved his forces for a better opportunity. This was not cowardice, but wisdom, the mark of a thinking soldier who understood that war was ultimately about achieving political objectives at acceptable cost. The entire German defensive strategy in early 1945 rested on this assumption, that eventually the Americans would perform their own cost-benefit analysis and conclude that the price of total victory was simply too high. Surely, the German High Command reasoned, once American casualties reached a certain threshold, once the newsreel showed enough flag-draped coffins arriving at Kansas City and Philadelphia and Portland, the American people would demand negotiation rather than annihilation. But the Americans who climbed out of their frozen foxholes that January morning carried a different calculation in their heads. It was not that they valued their own lives less. The letters they wrote home, the photographs they carried, the quiet conversations in the dark all testified to their fear and longing. Rather, they operated from a premise so foreign to the Wehrmacht mindset that it appeared almost incomprehensible. They believed that some objectives existed beyond the calculus of cost. Liberty was not negotiable at any price. Fascism could not be allowed to survive simply because destroying it proved expensive. The American soldier advancing through the Hurtgen forest understood something his German counterpart had forgotten in the years of pragmatic retreat and calculated defense, that there existed principles worth dying for not because death was cheap, but because life without those principles was unacceptable. Staff Sergeant Michael Kowalski of the 8th Infantry Division had written in a letter to his wife 3 days before the January offensive, "We are so tired. I cannot remember what it feels like to be warm or dry. But when I close my eyes, I see the newsreels from the liberated camps, and I know why we cannot stop. Not yet, not until it is finished." His platoon would take 60% casualties in the first hour of the attack. Kowalski himself would be wounded twice, refuse evacuation both times, and personally lead the assault on a reinforced bunker complex that had pinned down 2 companies for 3 days. He received the Distinguished Service Cross posthumously. His body was found 20 yards from the bunker entrance, his rifle empty, his hand still reaching forward. This was the quality that broke Muller's calculations, not superior firepower, though American artillery was abundant to the point of extravagance, not better training. The Wehrmacht still produced technically superior infantry tactics in many situations. What shattered the German defensive psychology was a relentless, almost mechanical refusal of American units to behave according to rational military theory. They absorbed casualties that should have triggered retreat and instead called for more ammunition. They lost ground that doctrine said should be abandoned and then counterattacked to retake on principle. When German positions anticipated surrender offers, American commanders sent attack orders. The message was clear. There would be no negotiation, no compromise, no settlement that left fascism intact even in a reduced form. Total victory or a total commitment. Nothing in between. The German soldiers facing this onslaught experienced a form of psychological disintegration that their training had never prepared them to resist. Gefreiter Hans Schmidt, captured after his position was overrun in late January, told his interrogators, "We kept waiting for them to stop. We knew they were taking terrible casualties. We could see the bodies. We heard the wounded crying in the night. But every morning, more came, always more. We began to think they had no limit, that America could simply produce soldiers the way we produce bullets endlessly, and that fighting them was like fighting the ocean. This perception of limitless abundance became a weapon as powerful as any artillery barrage. The German army in 1945 was starving, not metaphorically, but literally. Daily rations had dropped to levels that made sustained combat nearly impossible. Horses were slaughtered for food. Soldiers stripped leather from disabled vehicles to boil into grim soup. Ammunition was rationed so severely that infantry were ordered to conserve rounds for only the most critical moments. Into this landscape of scarcity came American soldiers whose supply situation seemed to German eyes like a fevered dream of plenty. Every captured American foxhole yielded treasures. Chocolate bars, cigarettes, canned meat, white bread, coffee that came in waterproof packets and tasted like actual coffee rather than the roasted grain substitute that had replaced it in German rations years earlier. Wounded American prisoners carried morphine syrettes and sulfa powder. Their uniforms were standardized, factory fresh, with wool that actually kept you warm. Their boots were made of real leather, properly sized, with spare laces. But it was not merely the material abundance that corroded German morale. It was what that abundance represented. Each can of ham, each pack of Lucky Strikes, each rubber sole boot served as a small proof of concept. This was what a free industrial democracy could produce when fully mobilized. The sheer casual waste of American logistics became its own form of propaganda. Soldiers who had been told that the democracies were weak, decadent, incapable of matching German will and discipline, found themselves facing an enemy who could afford to throw away more in a week than the Wehrmacht could produce in a month. The symbolic power of a discarded chocolate bar, found in the mud by a German soldier whose last meal had been thin potato soup, was immense. It whispered, "You've already lost. Your ideology promised strength through unity and discipline, but it has delivered only hunger. Our ideology, which you were told was soft and individualistic, has delivered so much abundance that we can afford to leave our excess scattered in the mud for our enemies to find." Oberst Muller understood this in the days following the January offensive as he watched his defensive line collapse not through any single catastrophic breakthrough, but through the steady erosion of will. Soldiers who had held positions against previous attacks suddenly began surrendering in groups. Officers reported that men were no longer responding to ideological exhortations. The propaganda that had sustained the Wehrmacht through years of fighting, the narrative of defending European civilization against Bolshevik hordes and Anglo-American plutocrats, had lost its power to motivate soldiers whose daily reality was starvation, cold, and the steady advance of an enemy that refused to behave according to any rational military theory. When the Americans finally overran Muller's command post in early February, he was surprised by the behavior of his captors. They did not execute him. They did not subject him to the ritual humiliations that captured Soviet officers endured. They gave him coffee, real coffee, and a cigarette, and processed him through a prisoner handling system that operated with bureaucratic efficiency. He was fed that evening, a meal that included white bread and canned peaches. The casual normality of it, the utter absence of vengeance or cruelty, was somehow more devastating than any punishment could have been. It suggested that defeating the Wehrmacht was not even particularly difficult for these Americans, merely a task to be completed with industrial thoroughness before moving on to the next item on democracy's agenda. The pattern Muller experienced in the Hurtgen Forest repeated itself across the entire Western Front in the winter and spring of 1945. At Remagen, when American scouts discovered the Ludendorff Bridge still intact, every conventional military calculation suggested that the Germans would demolish it within hours, that attempting to force a crossing was suicide. The Americans charged across under direct fire, engineers running with wire cutters and demolition teams, infantry sprinting through artillery barrage, and secured the first bridgehead across the Rhine. German commanders had expected negotiation for crossing rights, or at minimum a weeks-long siege. Instead, they got American combat engineers building pontoon bridges while under fire, tank columns crossing within hours, and an entire Rhine defensive line rendered irrelevant in less than a week. At the Ruhr Pocket, surrounded German forces that outnumbered their American besiegers waited for the traditional offer terms, an honorable surrender, preservation of officers' status, guarantees of treatment according to military convention. Instead, they received ultimatums, unconditional surrender by deadline or total assault. When the deadline passed, the Americans attacked with the same relentless methodology they had demonstrated in the Hurtgen Forest. General Oberst Walter Model, commanding the trap forces, had been considered one of Germany's most capable defensive specialists. He had stopped Soviet offensives through brilliant tactical repositioning and calculated withdrawal. But he could not stop an enemy that seemed utterly indifferent to casualties, that replaced losses within days, that treated ammunition as if it were infinite. Model dissolved his command rather than order surrender. He considered dishonorable, then walked into a forest and shot himself. His final words to his aide were, "I cannot comprehend them. They fight like automatons, but also like fanatics. How does one defeat an enemy who calculates like a machine, but believes like Crusader?" This incomprehension was shared across the entire German officer corps in those final months. They had been trained to fight enemies who shared their fundamental assumptions about warfare, that it was a rational enterprise, that objectives had costs, that those costs could become prohibitive. The Wehrmacht had defeated the French in 1940 partly because French commanders, when faced with the unexpected Ardennes breakthrough, had calculated that defending Paris would require unacceptable casualties, and therefore had surrendered rather than see their capital destroyed. The Germans expected the Americans to make similar calculations. Instead, when they fought into German cities, American soldiers exhibited the same grinding advance they had shown in the forest. Aachen, the first German city to fall, became a block-by-block nightmare that consumed weeks and thousands of casualties. German commanders kept expecting the Americans to bypass it, to leave it encircled and move on. Instead, they reduced it to rubble, cleared every building, and only declared it secure when the last sniper had been dug out of the last basement. The message was clear. There would be no bypassing, no provisional settlements, no isolated pockets left for future negotiation. Total victory meant total victory. Japanese commanders in the Pacific Theater encountered the same incomprehensible enemy, but drew even more fatalistic conclusions. At Iwo Jima, General Tadamaki Kuribayashi had constructed a defensive system that was, by any objective measure, a masterpiece of military engineering. 21,000 defenders dug into 11 miles of tunnels, with interlocking fields of fire, pre-registered artillery, and sufficient supplies to resist for months. The island itself was strategically marginal. Capturing it would shorten bomber runs to Tokyo by a few hundred miles, but was hardly essential to ultimate victory. Kuribayashi expected that when American casualties reached a certain threshold, the Marine Corps would declare the cost excessive and simply bypass the island, blockading it into irrelevance. This was rational military thinking. This was how Japan itself had conducted warfare for centuries. Achieve victory where possible, accept stalemate where necessary, preserve forces for decisive battles. The Marines landed on February 19, 1945. They took 30% casualties on the first day, and they kept coming. They fought for 36 days in a lunar landscape of volcanic ash in concrete bunkers, using flamethrowers and satchel charges to clear positions one by one, suffering casualties at rates that would have caused any other military force to reconsider the operation's viability. Nearly 7,000 Americans died capturing an 8-square-mile island. Marine Corps commanders wept when they saw the casualty reports. And they never considered stopping. They poured in reinforcements, called in naval bombardment that turned sections of the island into glass, and fought with the same methodical intensity, whether they were winning or losing, whether casualties were light or catastrophic. Kuribayashi, in his final message before organizing a last suicidal banzai charge, wrote, "I believed I understood American psychology. I studied at Harvard. I toured your automobile factories. I thought you were merchants who would calculate cost above honor. I was wrong. You fight like us, with a totality I did not think your democracy capable of producing. This is how empires fall, not to superior enemies, but to enemies we fundamentally misunderstood. The symbolic object that haunted both German and Japanese consciousness in those final months was the sirashin. These small cans of preserved food, distributed to every American soldier, became totems of inexplicable power. Each ration contained not just calories but a statement. American logistics could deliver hot food to soldiers in foxholes halfway around the world. The Germans, eating sawdust bread and vegetable soup thin as dishwater, found discarded rations everywhere the Americans had been. The Japanese, starving on bypassed islands, would find cash rations in captured positions and weep at the casual abundance they represented. But it was not merely the food itself that carried symbolic weight. It was the implications. A nation that could afford to give every soldier chocolate and coffee and canned beef, that could wrap each meal in waterproof packaging and deliver it to the front lines with factory precision, was demonstrating a form of power that transcended military force. It was saying, our system works. Our democracy, which you told your soldiers was weak and inefficient, is actually so strong that we can feed our armies better than you feed your civilians. Our individualistic culture, which you claim could never match your collective discipline, has produced such overwhelming industrial might that we are burying you in material excess. Private First Class Robert Jensen, fighting through Germany with the 3rd Armored Division, wrote in his diary about finding a German soldier's last letter home. The soldier had described eating grass to supplement his rations, had complained that his boots had holes and he had no socks, had mentioned that he had not tasted meat in 3 weeks. Jensen wrote, I read this while eating a chocolate bar I had been saving. I had 3 more in my pack. I had dry socks. My boots were good. I felt sick, not because I was better supplied. I was grateful for that, but sick because it made clear what we were really fighting. Not just their army, but their whole ideology. They had told their people that strength came from unity and sacrifice. We were proving that strength actually comes from liberty and abundance. Each chocolate bar was a referendum on competing systems, and they were losing that referendum so badly that their soldiers were eating grass. The psychological impact of this material disparity cannot be overstated. German soldiers had been raised on propaganda that portrayed Americans as soft, individualistic, incapable of the collective sacrifice required for total war. When those supposedly soft Americans kept advancing through casualties that should have broken any rational army, when they did so, while better fed and better supplied than German soldiers had been even in the victorious early years, it triggered a cognitive collapse. The entire Nazi worldview rested on the premise that their authoritarian system was more efficient, more powerful, more capable of mobilizing national resources than any democracy. But here was empirical evidence to the contrary. The democracy was outproducing them by orders of magnitude, and its citizens turned soldiers were demonstrating a commitment to total victory that matched or exceeded anything the Wehrmacht could muster. This realization spread through German ranks like poison. Soldiers who fought fanatically in Russia, who had endured Stalingrad and Kursk without breaking, began surrendering the West not because they feared American captivity, but because they no longer believed in the cause. The propaganda had promised them that sacrifice would lead to victory, that discipline would overcome material disadvantage, that will alone could triumph over mere industrial capacity. Every encounter with American forces disproved these promises. The cognitive dissonance became unbearable. Some soldiers, particularly the young fanatics of the SS, resolved this dissonance by fighting to the death. Convinced that they could not achieve victory, they could at least demonstrate ideological purity. But most Wehrmacht soldiers, exhausted and hungry and increasingly aware that they had been lied to about everything from casualty figures to strategic position, simply gave up. Not gave up fighting. They were soldiers and they followed orders, but gave up believing. The light went out of their eyes. They performed their duties mechanically, waiting for the end they now understood was inevitable. The transformation was visible in prisoner interrogations. Early in the war, captured German soldiers had been defiant, certain of ultimate victory, willing to endure harsh treatment because they believed they were fighting for something larger than themselves. By spring 1945, prisoners were cooperative to the point of numbness. They answered questions not out of cowardice, but from profound disillusionment, one interrogator noted. They seem relieved to be captured, not because they fear death. These are hard men who have seen terrible combat, but relieved that they no longer have to sustain the pretense of believing. In captivity, they can finally admit what they've begun to suspect, that they were fighting for a lie, that their sacrifices have been exploited by leaders who cared nothing for their welfare, and that the enemy they had been taught to despise was in fact demonstrating what a properly organized society could achieve. The Americans themselves were often unaware of the ideological weight their actions carried. They were not philosopher soldiers consciously demonstrating the superiority of democratic systems. They were mostly draftees who wanted to go home, who missed their families, who were terrified and exhausted and just trying to survive until victory may return possible. But their very ordinariness carried ideological power. These were not Nietzschean supermen or products of eugenic breeding programs. They were farm boys from Iowa and factory workers from Detroit and shopkeepers' sons from Philadelphia. They represented a cross-section of American diversity. White and black and Hispanic and Asian, Protestant and Catholic and Jewish and secular, educated and unschooled. And they were defeating the Wehrmacht. The implications were unavoidable. If ordinary democratic citizens, given adequate training and equipment, could match or exceed performance of Germany's ideologically indoctrinated professional soldiers, then perhaps the entire fascist premise was false. Perhaps liberty did not make men weak. Perhaps diversity was not a fatal flaw. Perhaps democracy was not a failed system, but rather the only system capable of mobilizing the full potential of its population. This was the transformation that haunted Axis commanders in those final months. They had begun the war confident in their superiority. certain that their authoritarian systems would crush the inefficient democracies through sheer force of will. They ended the war watching those democracies demonstrate levels of industrial production, military effectiveness, and societal mobilization that no totalitarian state had ever achieved. The Americans and British were not just winning. They were winning while maintaining democratic institutions, while holding elections, while allowing their citizens freedoms that would have been unthinkable in Berlin or Tokyo. The contrast was damning. Fascism had promised that only through total state control could a nation achieve greatness. Democracy was proving that greatness emerged from liberty, that free peoples fought with determination that matched or exceeded anything coercion could produce. On May 7, 1945, in a schoolhouse in Reims, General Oberst Alfred Jodl signed the instrument of German unconditional surrender. He was a professional soldier, a staff officer who had served with technical competence throughout the war. When asked if he had any final statement, he said, "We believe that discipline and what could overcome material advantage. We were wrong. But more than that, we were wrong about what produces discipline and will. We thought it came from authority imposed from above. You proved it comes from conviction rising from below. A soldier who fights because he believes his cause will always outlast a soldier who fights because he fears his superiors. We forgot this. It destroyed us. The epilogue to this transformation extends beyond the battlefield. In the decades following 1945, the psychological impact of watching democratic armies achieve total victory rippled through global consciousness. The Cold War became, in many ways, a continuation of the same ideological contest. Could authoritarian systems match democratic performance? The Soviet Union had contributed massively to defeating fascism, but it had done so as a totalitarian state facing an existential threat, using methods, mass conscription, purges, political commissars, that reinforce authoritarian logic. The Western democracies had demonstrated something more troubling to authoritarian theory. They had voluntarily mobilized, had matched totalitarian ruthlessness without abandoning democratic governance, and had done so with such overwhelming material superiority that the contest was never really in doubt once American industry fully engaged. This lesson was not lost on post-war planners in Moscow or Beijing. They understood that any future conflict would require matching not just American military capability, but American productive capacity. And they suspected, though they could not publicly admit it, that this might be impossible so long as their systems remained closed and controlled. The chocolate bar, that small symbol of American abundance, appears throughout post-war memoirs from former Axis soldiers. It represented more than mere food. It was evidence that liberty worked, that democracy could produce both moral conviction and material prosperity, that the free exchange of ideas and goods created systems more resilient and powerful than anything authoritarianism could construct. German veterans will remember finding American rations and experiencing a moment of clarity. The enemy was not winning through some temporary advantage, but through systemic superiority. Their whole society was organized more effectively. Their ideology produced better outcomes. This was not propaganda. It was observable fact, written in chocolate and coffee, and the endless flow of supplies that kept American armies advancing while German forces starved. In the Pacific, the lesson was even more stark. Japanese society had organized itself around concepts of duty, sacrifice, and collective purpose that made individual welfare irrelevant. Soldiers were expected to die for the emperor without question, to endure any hardship, to sacrifice everything for national glory. This ideology produced fierce fighters willing to undertake suicidal missions. But it did not produce victory. The Americans, who allowed their soldiers to complain, who rotated troops out of combat zones, who provided rest and recreation, and actually care about individual welfare, built a military machine that simply ground Japanese resistance into dust. The kamikazes flying into American ships were brave and committed, but they were also desperate, product of a system that had run out of options and now had nothing left to offer but ritualized death. The American sailors who shot them down returned to carriers that had ice cream machines and mail call and movies shown on the hangar deck. The contrast was grotesque and perfect. One side offering its youth nothing but death, the other offering them life and victory and the promise of returned prosperity. This is what Axis commanders had not expected when they started the war. They had calculated material factors, divisions, tanks, ships, and had concluded they could achieve quick victories before American production ramped up. What they failed to calculate was will. Not the will of their own soldiers, which they took for granted, but the will of democratic citizens who had decided that fascism represented an existential threat to human liberty. That decision, once made, proved unshakable. American soldiers were not fighting for territorial gain or imperial glory. They were fighting because they believed, truly believed, that the world their children inherited had to be free of Nazism and militaristic fascism. This conviction sustained them through horrific casualties, kept them climbing out of foxholes when every instinct screamed to stay down, drove them forward when surrender would have been tactically rational. The recurring sound that haunted those final battles was artillery. The Americans used it with extravagance that appalled German officers trained to conserve ammunition. When faced with a defended position, American doctrine was simple. Call in artillery. Not a few rounds, but a barrage, hundreds or thousands of shells, an expenditure of resources that German logistics could never have sustained. This, too, was ideological statement disguised as tactics. It said, "We value our soldiers' lives enough to use material abundance to protect them. We will spend shells instead of lives whenever possible. Our system produces so much that we can afford to be wasteful in service of bringing our people home alive." The German system, which claimed to value the Volk, sent its soldiers into battle with inadequate support and called this sacrifice noble. The American system, which fascist propaganda claimed was individualistic and weak, protected its individuals with collective firepower that no totalitarian state could match. On August 15th, 1945, Emperor Hirohito addressed his nation by radio for the first time in history, announcing Japan's surrender. His voice, tinny and formal, spoke of bearing the unbearable and enduring the unendurable. What he did not say, but what every Japanese soldier understood, was that they had been defeated not by an enemy more willing to die, but by an enemy more capable of living. The Americans had built a military machine that did not require suicidal charges because it could afford overwhelming force. They had constructed a logistics system that delivered victory through systematic application of resources rather than through spiritual purity or death worship. Bushido had promised that Japanese spirit would overcome material disadvantage. Instead, material advantage wielded by spiritually motivated democratic soldiers had reduced Bushido to a fatal delusion. The lesson was universal and devastating to authoritarian ideology. When free peoples decide something matters, when they voluntarily commit to a cause, they are more dangerous than any conscript army or indoctrinated fanatic. Because their commitment comes from conviction rather than coercion, it sustains them through setbacks that would break force unity. Because their systems protect individual welfare, they can mobilize more effectively and sustain operations longer. Because their societies value innovation and free exchange, they produce technological and industrial advantages that rigid hierarchies cannot match. The fascist premise that democracy was weak, that liberty made men soft, that only authoritarian discipline could forge true power, was not merely defeated but utterly disproven. The proof was written in the smoking ruins of Berlin and Tokyo, in the millions of casualties Axis forces suffered trying to stop enemies they had fundamentally misunderstood, in the chocolate bars and coffee packets that symbolize a truth more powerful than any propaganda. Freedom works. That is a legacy of those men who charged through fire when their enemies expected surrender. They were not superhuman. They were ordinary people who lived in a system that respected their humanity enough to feed them, supply them, and give them cause worth fighting for. They prove that such people, when threatened, are the most formidable force on earth. Not because they love war, but because they love peace enough to pay war's costs in full. Not because they seek glory, but because they seek a world where their children will not have to make the same sacrifice. This was incomprehensible to commanders who viewed soldiers as expendable tools of state power. And that incomprehension, more than any tactical failure, sealed their defeat and vindicated the proposition that all men are created equal, that liberty is not weakness but strength, and that democracy, for all its flaws, remains humanity's best answer to the eternal question of how power should be organized and for what ends it should be employed.